My wife texted, "Please don't wear your uniform to our wedding. Don't disgrace me, please." But I walked out, in a white uniform, 4 stars on my shoulder. 200 SEALs stood and saluted. Admiral on deck. Blood didn't salute. I stood behind those heavy oak chapel doors, feeling the weight of everything I'd ever been pressed into the crisp lines of my white dress uniform. 4 stars gleamed on my shoulder, stars I'd earned through blood, grit, and sleepless nights in places most people couldn't even pronounce. My chest was a roadmap of service. Bronze stars, purple hearts, campaign ribbons that told stories I'd never share at dinner parties. Each medal had cost me something. A piece of my innocence, a fragment of my soul, sometimes the lives of good men who deserved better than the dirt they died in. Behind me stood my team, my brothers in arms who'd followed me through hell and back, without so much as flinching. These weren't just guys I worked with. They were the men who'd shared foxholes with me when the world was exploding around us, who'd carried me when I couldn't walk, who'd trust me with their lives even now, years after we'd all supposedly moved on to civilian life. Rodriguez was there, still carrying shrapnel in his left leg from Kandahar. Martinez had flown in from Colorado, probably spent his last paycheck on the plane ticket just to be here. These men didn't do emotional displays or grand gestures. They showed up. That was their language, and it spoke louder than any speech ever could. An MY phone buzzed in my pocket like a rattlesnake's warning. For a split second, I thought maybe it was tactical intel, some old habit from deployments where every notification could mean life or death. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq. This was my wedding day, supposedly the happiest day of my life, and the message that lit up my screen felt like a sniper's bullet finding its mark. "Please don't wear your uniform to our wedding. Don't disgrace me. Please." The words came from Eliza, the woman I was about to marry, the woman who'd said yes when I got down on one knee 6 months ago on that cliff overlooking the Pacific. The same woman who'd spent the last 2 years telling me she loved my strength, my discipline, my unwavering sense of honor. Apparently, she loved those things right up until they came in navy white with ribbons and brass buttons. You know what didn't happen? My hands didn't shake like some rookie on his first patrol. My heart didn't drop into my boots like I'd just taken incoming fire. I just stood there, stone still, reading those words over and over again. "Don't disgrace me." As if everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, every mission that had carved pieces out of my soul was somehow shameful. As if the uniform that represented 30 years of my life was an embarrassment she couldn't bear to be associated with. The thing is, that message wasn't really a surprise. It was more like a confirmation of something I'd been trying not to see for months. Eliza loved me, sure, but she loved a sanitized version of me. The guy in the tailored suits at embassy dinners. The one who could make small talk about wine and politics without mentioning the taste of dust and cordite. She'd fallen for Admiral Alden Mercer, the decorated war hero who looked good on paper and even better in photographs. But she'd never really wanted to know Staff Sergeant Mercer, the kid from Ohio who'd learned to kill before he could legally drink, or Lieutenant Mercer, who'd held dying men in his arms and promised their mothers he'd bring them home. She loved the medals, but not the wars that forged them. She wanted the respect that came with my rank, but not the scars that came with earning it. Every time I tried to tell her about the things that kept me awake at night, she'd get this look. Not disgust, exactly, but something close to it. Like I was tracking mud on her clean white carpet. She'd change the subject, suggest we talk about something more pleasant, maybe plan another weekend getaway where we could pretend I'd never been anywhere more dangerous than a country club. But here's the thing about being a SEAL. You don't get to pick and choose which parts of yourself you bring to the fight. You show up whole, scars and all, or you don't show up at all. And after everything I'd been through, everything I'd seen and done and survived, I wasn't about to start hiding who I was. Not for her, not for anybody. So I walked out anyway. Head high, spine straight, medals catching the afternoon light streaming through those stained glass windows. Because this uniform wasn't just cloth and buttons and pretty ribbons. It was every mission I'd completed, every man I'd saved, every order I'd given that kept my team breathing for another day. It was Rodriguez's kids getting to grow up with their father, and Martinez's wife not having to fold a flag at his funeral. It was proof that sometimes, when everything goes to hell, there are still people willing to stand between the wolves and the sheep. The moment those chapel doors swung open, something beautiful happened. 200 SEALs, Marines, and Navy personnel rose to their feet like they were connected by invisible wires. The sound of their boots hitting the floor was like thunder, and then came the words that made my throat tight. Admiral on deck. Not because they had to, not because some regulation required it, but because they wanted to, because they understood what that uniform meant, what it had cost, and why it mattered. In that moment, standing in that doorway with my brothers at my back and my future waiting at the altar, I realized something important. Eliza might not understand the man she was marrying, but these men did. And maybe that would have to be enough. My father, Commander Gerald Mercer, wasn't just a Navy man. He was the Navy, carved from steel and discipline, forged in an era when emotions were weaknesses and sentiment was for civilians. 3 decades of service had turned him into something harder than the ships he commanded, a man who measured everything in degrees of precision and found the world constantly falling short of military standards. Our house wasn't a home. It was a forward operating base where love was expressed through inspection-ready quarters and perfectly aligned shoes. Growing up under his roof was like living in a perpetual state of basic training. Reveille at 0600, bed made with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter off. Breakfast eaten in silence while he read intelligence briefings and maritime reports. His coffee mug positioned exactly 2 inches from his right hand, handle pointing due east. Every morning, he'd inspect my room like he was checking for contraband, running his finger along surfaces I'd already cleaned twice, adjusting picture frames that were already perfectly straight. Nothing was ever quite good enough, never quite up to his standards. That my mother, Marla, was the soft counterpoint to his sharp edges. She had this way of moving through our regimented world like water flowing around rocks, finding the spaces where warmth could exist. While Dad barked orders about posture and protocol, Mom would slip me extra cookies when he wasn't looking, her fingers gentle as she smoothed my hair before school. She had these eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and she laughed often in those early years, like she was determined to fill our house with something besides the sound of marching feet and military precision. When I was 13, cancer took her away from us in 6 brutal months. One day she was there, humming while she folded laundry, and the next she was a ghost haunting hospital corridors, getting smaller and frilier until she just wasn't. The house felt different after that, like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of it. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence became so thick you could choke on it. That's when my father stopped talking altogether. Not that he'd been chatty before, but at least there had been conversations about duty and discipline, lectures about military history and the importance of following orders. After Mom died, those dried up too. The only words that passed between us were purely functional. Clean your rifle, fix your posture, your grades are slipping. Everything else was communicated through glances, nods, and the kind of suffocating silence that makes you question whether you even exist. Our house became a tomb filled with the ghosts of words we never spoke. I'd catch him sometimes, staring at the empty chair where Mom used to sit, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. But if I tried to talk about her, about how much we both missed her, he'd just turn away and find something that needed cleaning or organizing. Grief wasn't in his vocabulary, and emotions were enemy combatants to be neutralized before they could compromise the mission. The only conversations we had revolved around the holy trinity of military life: posture, grades, and gear maintenance. Stand up straight, son. A slouching soldier is a dead soldier. These grades are unacceptable. Excellence isn't optional. Clean this weapon like your life depends on it, because someday it will. Everything was about preparation, about being ready for some unnamed battle that was always coming, always just over the horizon. I learned to strip and clean an M16 before I learned to drive. I could execute a perfect about-face before I could ask a girl to dance. By the time I was 16, I could march in formation, tie 20 different knots, and recite the chain of command from memory, but I couldn't tell you what my father's favorite color was, or whether he'd ever been scared of anything in his entire life. When I told him I was enlisting at 18, straight out of high school, he didn't congratulate me, or shake my hand, or do any of the things normal fathers might do. He just looked at me with those steel gray eyes and said, "Let's see how long you last." Not, "I'm proud of you," or "I believe in you," or even "good luck." Just a challenge wrapped in doubt. like he was placing bets on my failure before I'd even started. Boot camp was a joke after growing up in his house. The drill instructors screamed and cursed and tried to break us down, but I'd been living with their spiritual grandfather for 18 years. While other recruits cried themselves to sleep or cracked under the pressure, I just went through the motions. This was familiar territory, and I navigated it like I was walking through my childhood bedroom with my eyes closed. When I got accepted to Annapolis, it should have been the proudest moment of my life. Naval Academy. Every Navy brat dreams of walking those hallowed halls, joining the ranks of officers who'd shaped maritime history. I called him from the payphone outside the recruiting station, my hands actually shaking as I dialed the number I'd memorized before I could tie my shoes. "Dad, I got in. Annapolis accepted me." Silence. Then, "Don't let it go to your head." That was it. No congratulations, no acknowledgement of what it meant to be accepted into one of the most prestigious military academies in the world. Just a warning not to get too proud of myself, like pride was a disease that could compromise my effectiveness. Graduation day at the academy was supposed to be different. 4 years of hell, 4 years of proving myself, 4 years of becoming the kind of officer who could lead men into battle and bring them home alive. I scanned the crowd of families, looking for that familiar ramrod posture, those unforgiving eyes. But he wasn't there. Empty seat in a sea of proud parents. Like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile, he never said, "I'm proud of you." Never acknowledged what I'd accomplished or who I'd become. But you know what? I chased excellence anyway. Not because I was trying to win his approval. I'd given up on that years ago. I did it because I had to survive in a world that didn't care about your daddy issues or your emotional baggage. I did it because somewhere along the way, I'd learned that the only approval that mattered was the kind you gave yourself when you looked in the mirror and knew you'd done everything you could to be worthy of the trust others placed in you. War didn't scare me the way it should have. Hell, after growing up in my father's house, combat zones felt almost comfortable. At least there, the rules were clear and the enemy was obvious. You knew who was trying to kill you and why, and what you had to do to make it through another day. What scared me wasn't the bullets or the bombs or the possibility of dying in some godforsaken desert halfway around the world. What kept me awake at night was the terrifying prospect of becoming my father, that cold, unreachable man who'd turned silence into a weapon and emotional distance into an art form. But somewhere between my 3rd deployment and my 5th, something shifted. Maybe it was watching too many good men die for causes they barely understood, or maybe it was realizing that leadership wasn't about being the hardest bastard in the room. Whatever it was, I started becoming a different version of him, one I could actually live with. I kept the discipline, the attention to detail, the unwavering commitment to the mission. But I added something he'd never learned, the ability to give a damn about the men under my command, that I became disciplined without being cruel, respected without being feared. My guys knew I'd push them hard, demand excellence, hold them to standards that would make their mothers weep, but they also knew I'd bleed for them if it came to that. And in Somalia, during what was supposed to be a routine extraction mission, it literally came to that. We'd been tracking a high-value target through the narrow streets of Mogadishu when everything went sideways faster than you could say Black Hawk Down. Intel had been wrong. Shocking, I know. And what should have been a quick grab-and-go turned into a full-scale firefight with half the city trying to turn us into hamburger meat. The sound of AK-47s echoed off the concrete walls like deadly rain, and the air was thick with dust and cordite and the metallic taste of fear. That's when I saw him. Private Danny Morrison, 19 years old, fresh-faced kid from Nebraska who still wrote letters to his mom every week. A sniper's bullet had found the gap in his body armor, and he was down in the middle of the street, bleeding out while enemy fire stitched patterns in the dirt around him. No way to reach him with a vehicle, no way to lay down enough suppressing fire to make it safe. Just a kid dying in the dirt while his brothers watched from behind cover. My team leader was already calling it. "He's gone, sir. We can't risk the whole squad for one man." Standard operating procedure, textbook tactics. Sometimes you have to make the hard choice and leave people behind. But looking at Morrison, seeing the fear in his eyes as he realized he was about to die alone in a foreign country, I couldn't do it. Wouldn't do it. "Cover me," I said, and before anyone could argue, I was moving. The sprint to reach him felt like it lasted forever and happened in an instant. Bullets snapped past my head like angry wasps, kicking up little geysers of dust and concrete chips. Halfway there, something hot punched through my left side. Felt like getting hit with a baseball bat made of molten steel. A few steps later, another round caught me in the shoulder, spinning me around like a rag doll. But I kept moving, kept pushing forward, because stopping meant Morrison died, and I lived with that for the rest of my miserable life. That I reached him just as his eyes were starting to glaze over. "Hey, Nebraska," I said, dragging him into the meager cover of a burned-out car. "Your mom's gonna be pissed if you die on my watch." He tried to smile, blood foaming at the corners of his mouth, and I knew we were running out of time. Getting him back to the rally point was the longest 200 yards of my life. 2 bullets in me, one kid who weighed about as much as a small refrigerator, and what felt like the entire Somali militia trying to punch our tickets. I half-carried, half-dragged him through that maze of bullets and debris, my side on fire and my shoulder screaming, while my team laid down enough covering fire to level a city block. The medics worked on both of us in the back of that dusty Humvee. Morrison unconscious but breathing, me trying to stay awake long enough to make sure he made it to the field hospital. The last thing I remember before the morphine kicked in was the medic saying, "Jesus Christ, sir, you've got ice water in your veins. How the hell did you stay so calm out there?" That's how I got the nickname Iceback. Not because I was cold or emotionless, but because when everything went to hell, I stayed cool enough to do what needed doing. It stuck, following me through promotions and transfers, becoming part of my reputation in the teams. But the name never mattered as much as what came after. Morrison recovered, went home to Nebraska, married his high school sweetheart, and had 3 kids. Every Christmas, I get a card with a picture of his family, and every year there's a note that says the same thing. "Thank you for bringing me home." A few years ago, he named his youngest son Alden, after me. When he told me that over the phone, I had to sit down because my legs went weak. That name, my name, on that little boy meant more to me than every medal in my dress uniform combined. Because it meant I'd made someone want to live, made it possible for love to continue, for a family to exist, for a future to unfold that wouldn't have been there without that crazy sprint through gunfire in a dusty street halfway around the world. That's what leadership meant to me after that day. Keep your people alive. Not just breathing, but truly alive. Able to go home, to love and be loved, to build something worth building. Everything else was just paperwork and politics. But keeping your people alive, that was sacred. Eliza was everything I wasn't supposed to fall for, and maybe that's exactly why I did. She was a tech consultant who moved through Washington, D.C.'s political circles like she'd been born to it. All grace and sharp intelligence wrapped in designer dresses that probably cost more than my monthly salary. We met during one of those veterans fundraising galas that I usually avoided like the plague. Too much small talk, too many people who wanted to shake hands with a war hero, but couldn't handle hearing what war actually looked like. I was nursing a whiskey in the corner, counting down the minutes until I could politely escape, when she appeared beside me like smoke. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, and her voice had this quality that made you want to lean in closer. She was right, of course, but something about the way she said it, without judgment, just observation, made me want to stick around and see what came next. She was drawn to what she called my quiet strength, the way I carried myself with military bearing even in civilian clothes. She loved how I never dominated conversations, never felt the need to prove anything to anyone. "You're like a still lake," she told me once, running her fingers along my jaw. "So calm on the surface, but I can sense all this depth underneath." What she didn't understand was that the stillness wasn't zen, it was survival. In my world, the loudest guy in the room was usually the first one to catch a bullet. For 2 years, we danced around each other in this careful waltz where she got to admire my discipline and composure, and I got to pretend. I was the kind of man who belonged in her world of wine tastings and embassy dinners. She'd introduce me to her friends as Admiral Mercer, and I could see the little thrill it gave her, being with someone who commanded respect just by walking into a room. I looked good on her arm, tall, decorated, the kind of man who opened doors and pulled out chairs and never raised his voice. But here's the thing about loving half a person. Eventually, the other half starts to bleed through, and that's when you find out what someone's really made of. The first crack showed when I told her about my tours overseas. We were having dinner at some upscale bistro in Georgetown, and she asked where I'd been stationed. Should have been a simple question, right? But when I started mentioning Afghanistan and Iraq, Somalia and Syria, her face went pale, and she reached for her wine glass like it was a life preserver. God, Alden, she whispered. All those dangerous places. I can't imagine. She couldn't imagine, and more importantly, she didn't want to. Every time I tried to share something real about my experience, not the glory and heroics she'd read about in magazines, but the actual weight of command, the responsibility of keeping men alive, the way certain sounds could still make me reach for a weapon that wasn't there, she'd get this look. Not disgust, exactly, but something close to it. Like I was tracking mud through her pristine world. Maybe we could talk about something more pleasant, she'd say, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. How about we plan that weekend in Napa you mentioned? And just like that, the conversation would pivot to safer ground. Wine country and spa treatments and anything that didn't involve the reality of what I'd done and seen in service to my country. When I mentioned going to therapy to deal with some of the heavier stuff. Not PTSD, exactly, but the kind of processing every combat veteran needs to do if they want to stay human. She actually winced. Do you really think that's necessary? She asked. I mean, you seem fine to me. Maybe it's better to just move forward? Focus on the future instead of dwelling on the past. That's when I should have known. When someone thinks your scars are something to get over rather than something that made you who you are, when they want you to lock away the parts of yourself that don't fit their vision of who you should be, that's not love. That's possession. But I was stubborn, or maybe just lonely, so I kept trying to make it work. I proposed to her at sunset on the coast, got down on one knee like some romantic movie hero, and when she said yes with tears streaming down her face, I thought maybe we'd found our way through. Maybe love really could conquer all the complicated, messy parts of being human. The wedding planning should have been a celebration, but instead it became a slow-motion negotiation where I kept giving up pieces of myself. First, it was the guest list. Do you really need to invite your whole team? She'd ask. I mean, it's going to be such an elegant affair. Maybe just keep it to family and close friends. Translation, your brothers in arms don't fit the aesthetic. Then it was the details. Maybe you could wear dress shoes instead of military boots? They're so formal. The boots I'd worn through 3 combat zones, polished to mirror shine, weren't classy enough for her wedding. Our wedding, supposedly, but increasingly it felt like I was just a prop in her perfect day. The final straw came the night before we were supposed to say I do. I was in my hotel room, looking at my dress whites hanging in the closet, the uniform I'd earned through blood and sacrifice, the visible representation of everything I'd given in service to something bigger than myself. My phone buzzed, and there it was. Please don't wear your uniform to our wedding. Don't disgrace me. Please, don't disgrace me. As if 30 years of service was something shameful. As if the medals on my chest were participation trophies instead of recognition for keeping good men alive in impossible situations. As if the uniform that represented the best of who I was would somehow taint her perfect day. That message wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation of what I'd been trying not to see for months. Eliza loved Admiral Mercer, the impressive man who looked good at dinner parties. But she'd never really wanted to know the warrior who'd earned that rank, or understand the cost of becoming someone others could follow into hell. I didn't invite my team to the wedding. Hell, I barely invited anyone. Figured these guys had families to take care of, jobs to work, lives to live that didn't revolve around watching their old commanding officer tie the knot with a woman who thought military service was something you did quietly and then moved on from. They'd done enough for me over the years, bled enough, sacrificed enough. The last thing they needed was to burn vacation days and plane ticket money to watch me make what was probably a huge mistake. But that's the thing about brotherhood forged in combat. It doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't wait for invitations. They started showing up Thursday morning, 3 days before the ceremony. First was Rodriguez, rolling into town in his beat-up Chevy pickup with Georgia plates. That same crooked grin he'd worn when he told Taliban fighters exactly what they could do with their roadside bombs. He'd driven 12 hours straight from Atlanta, took time off from his construction job, probably spent grocery money on gas just to be there. Sir, he said, snapping to attention in the hotel lobby like we were still in some forward operating base instead of the marble-floored elegance of the Ritz-Carlton. Heard you were getting hitched. Figured somebody ought to make sure you don't screw it up. By Friday afternoon, there were 8 of them. Martinez flew in from Denver, still carrying himself like the sniper he'd been, eyes constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. Thompson drove up from Norfolk with his wife and kids. Beautiful family, the kind of American dream we'd all been fighting to protect. Johnson came in from Chicago, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, but trying to look respectable anyway. These weren't just guys I'd served with. They were men who'd followed me through the worst places on earth, who'd trusted me with their lives when trusting the wrong person meant coming home in a box. In Afghanistan, when we were pinned down by mortar fire for 6 hours, it was Rodriguez who'd crawled through razor wire to set up a field radio. In Iraq, when our convoy got hit by an IED, Martinez had provided overwatch while we evacuated the wounded, picking off insurgents with the kind of precision that kept us all breathing. They were my brothers. Not by blood. Blood was just an accident of genetics, something you got stuck with whether you wanted it or not. This was something stronger, something chosen and earned and sealed with the kind of shared experience that changes your DNA. We'd seen each other at our worst and best, had each other's backs when the whole world was trying to kill us, shared the kind of trust that only comes when you know someone would die before they'd let you down. By Saturday morning, the number had grown to 15. Word travels fast in the military community, and apparently the word was that Admiral Mercer was getting married and could use some backup. They came from all over, California, Texas, North Carolina, places I'd forgotten they'd moved to after discharge. Some drove, some flew, some probably hitchhiked for all I knew. The point was, they came. Retired Master Chief Hugo Lane showed up Saturday afternoon, 72 years old, and still looking like he could bench press a small car. Hugo had been my mentor when I was a green lieutenant who thought he knew everything and actually knew nothing. He'd taught me that leadership wasn't about being the smartest guy in the room. It was about surrounding yourself with smart people and then getting out of their way. Son, he said, clasping my hand in his bare paw grip, heard you might need some seasoned NCOs to keep you squared away on the big day. Then came Torres, and my throat went tight when I saw him. Staff Sergeant Miguel Torres, who'd lost his left leg below the knee to an IED in Syria while providing security for a humanitarian convoy. He was walking with a prosthetic now, still proud, still carrying himself like the warrior he'd always been. He'd flown in from Phoenix, probably broke the bank doing it, just to stand with me. Sir, he said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were bright. Couldn't let you do this alone. We've got your 6, like always. That evening, while Eliza was at her bachelorette party, probably complaining to her friends about how many military people were suddenly cluttering up her perfect wedding, my team gathered in the hotel bar. 15 men in various stages of civilian disguise, but you could spot the warrior in every one of them. The way they sat with their backs to walls, how their eyes tracked movement, the unconscious way they positioned themselves to cover each other's blind spots. So, Rodriguez said, raising his beer, anybody gonna tell the Admiral he's making a mistake, or are we just here to watch the train wreck? The laughter was rough, affectionate, the kind of dark humor that gets you through situations where regular people would break down crying. But underneath it was something serious, something that didn't need to be spoken out loud. They'd all met Eliza at various functions over the past 2 years. They'd seen how she looked at them. Not with hostility, exactly, but like they were relics from a part of my life she'd rather forget existed. She's not bad, Martinez said carefully. Just different. Different world, you know. Different values, added Thompson, and there was weight in those words. His wife serenaded, sipping her wine. She understood military families, knew what it meant to marry someone who'd sworn an oath to something bigger than themselves. Hugo spoke up from the corner, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the service. Question isn't whether she's right for him, he said. Question is whether he's still him when he's with her. Nobody answered that, because we all knew the answer. But they'd come anyway, these men who'd seen me at my best and worst, who knew what I was capable of when everything was on the line. They'd come because when you follow someone through hell, you don't just abandon them when they're walking into a different kind of battlefield, even if it's one they've chosen for themselves. Whatever happens tomorrow, Torres said, you're not walking alone. We've got your back, sir. Always have, always will. And in that moment, surrounded by these men who'd chosen to stand with me. I felt something I hadn't felt in months, like I was exactly where I belonged. The morning of the wedding arrived like a military operation I'd planned 1,000 times, but never actually wanted to execute. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room, adjusting the collar of my dress whites for the 10th time, every crease perfect, every button aligned, every ribbon positioned exactly where regulations dictated. The uniform felt different than it had the night before, heavier somehow, like it was carrying the weight of every decision that had led me to this moment. My hands were steady as I fastened the last button, muscle memory from decades of getting dressed for ceremonies that actually mattered. This should matter too, right? This was supposed to be the most important day of my life, the moment when everything I'd fought for finally made sense. But standing there in that sterile hotel room, looking at myself in dress whites that Eliza had begged me not to wear, I felt like I was suiting up for a mission I didn't fully understand. The chapel was only a 5-minute walk from the hotel, but it felt like crossing enemy territory. Each step on the marble floor echoed like gunshots, and I could feel people staring as I moved through the lobby. Some looked at me with respect, others with curiosity, a few with the kind of uncomfortable recognition you get when people know you've done things they don't want to think about. As I approached those heavy oak doors, I could hear the murmur of voices inside, the nervous energy of 200 people waiting for a show to begin. My team was already in position. I'd seen them earlier, scattered throughout the chapel in their own dress uniforms, looking like an honor guard that had assembled itself without orders. They weren't sitting together in some designated military section. They were integrated throughout the crowd, a quiet show of force that said more than any speech ever could. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the brass handle, and took one last moment to consider what I was about to do. Eliza's message from the night before was still burning in my pocket like a piece of shrapnel. Please don't wear your uniform to our wedding. Don't disgrace me. Please, don't disgrace her. As if everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd become was something to be ashamed of. But here's the thing about being in command. You don't get to hide from who you are when things get uncomfortable. You don't get to pretend you're someone else just because the truth might make people squirm. This uniform wasn't a costume I could take off when it became inconvenient. It was the visible representation of 30 years spent in service to something bigger than myself. That I pulled those doors open and stepped inside. The effect was immediate and electric. Before I'd taken 2 steps into that chapel, before the doors had even finished swinging shut behind me, I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of boots hitting the floor in unison. It started with my team. Rodriguez snapping to attention in the 3rd row, Martinez straightening like a steel rod in the 5th, Torres rising on his prosthetic leg with the kind of precision that would have made his drill instructors weep with pride. But it didn't stop with them. Like a wave rolling through the congregation, every man and woman in uniform rose to their feet. Active duty personnel, reservists, veterans who hadn't worn dress blues in decades but had dusted them off for this moment. They all stood as one, their movements sharp and synchronized, a spontaneous display of respect that filled the chapel with the sound of rustling fabric and creaking leather. Then came the words that hit me like a physical blow. Admiral on deck. The voice belonged to Master Chief Lane, but it was picked up and echoed by a dozen others, rolling through the chapel like thunder. 200 people standing at attention, not because regulations required it, not because some protocol demanded it, but because they chose to. Because they understood what this uniform represented, what it had cost, and what it meant to wear it with honor. I started walking down that aisle, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Each step was measured, deliberate, the kind of march I'd done at graduations and change of command ceremonies, at funerals for men who died too young in places too far from home. This was my cadence, my rhythm, the pace of a man who'd learned to walk through fire and come out the other side still standing. The civilians in the crowd looked stunned, some confused, others moved to tears by something they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. This wasn't just a groom walking to his bride. This was a warrior being honored by his tribe, a leader being acknowledged by the men who'd followed him into hell and lived to tell about it. At the altar, Eliza stood in her perfect white dress, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame. She'd wanted a wedding, not a military ceremony. She'd wanted Admiral Mercer, the distinguished gentleman, not the warrior who'd earned those stars through blood and sacrifice. But you don't get to love half a person and expect the other half to just disappear when it becomes inconvenient. Her eyes met mine as I approached, and I could see the question there. Why couldn't you just be normal? Why couldn't you just be the man I wanted you to be? But standing there in that chapel, surrounded by the men who'd seen me at my worst and chosen to follow me anyway, I finally had an answer. Because normal men don't end up with 4 stars on their shoulders. Normal men don't earn the kind of respect that makes 200 people stand up without being asked. Normal men don't get the privilege of leading warriors into battle and bringing them home alive. I wasn't walking down that aisle alone. I was carrying every mission I'd completed, every decision I'd made, every life I'd saved or failed to save. I was walking with the ghosts of good men who died under my command, and the living proof that sometimes leadership really does matter. The chapel fell silent as I reached the altar, 200 people still standing at attention, waiting. This wasn't the wedding Eliza had planned, but it was the one she was getting. Because sometimes, the truth about who you are can't be hidden behind civilian clothes and careful words. Sometimes, you have to wear your scars where everyone can see them. Our vows were simple, almost clinical in their brevity. I promised to honor, not just love, because love was easy when everything was perfect, but honor was something you held on to when the world went to hell around you. She promised to try to understand, not to accept, not to embrace, but to try. Even standing there at the altar, surrounded by flowers and candlelight and all the trappings of happily ever after, we both knew we were making promises we weren't sure we could keep. The ceremony itself felt like a negotiation disguised as a celebration. When the chaplain asked if I would take Eliza as my wife, my I do came out steady and clear, but it felt like signing a treaty with terms I hadn't fully read. When she said the same words back to me, there was something in her voice, not doubt, exactly, but a kind of resigned determination, like she was convincing herself as much as anyone else. The kiss was perfect for the cameras, soft and romantic, and everything a wedding kiss should be. But underneath it, I could feel the distance between us, the careful space she maintained even in that moment of supposed unity. It was the kind of kiss you gave someone you cared about but didn't entirely trust, affectionate but guarded, sweet but holding something back. The reception was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Eliza had planned every detail with military precision. Ironic, considering how she felt about actual military precision. And the result was elegant, sophisticated, exactly the kind of event that would look perfect in the society pages. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with white roses and gold accents, and a string quartet played classical music that nobody really listened to but everyone agreed was lovely. My team mingled awkwardly with her crowd. Warriors in dress uniforms trying to make small talk with tech executives and political consultants who spoke in acronyms they'd learned in boardrooms instead of blood. Rodriguez attempted conversation with one of Eliza's college friends, a venture capitalist who kept asking about exit strategies, without realizing she was talking to a man whose exit strategy from most situations involved covering fire and tactical movement. The speeches were predictably polite, full of generic wishes for happiness and inside jokes that weren't actually funny to anyone outside Eliza's inner circle. Her maid of honor talked about how perfect we were together, how Eliza had found someone who could match her ambition and sophistication. Nobody mentioned the fact that my idea of sophistication was knowing which end of a rifle to point at the enemy. By the time the dancing started, I needed air more than I needed social interaction. The reception hall felt like it was closing in, all those carefully modulated conversations and diplomatic smiles wearing me down like Chinese water torture. I slipped out through the French doors onto the terrace, where the evening air was cool and clean and didn't smell like expensive perfume and political ambition. The terrace overlooked the hotel gardens, manicured lawns, and precisely trimmed hedges that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never seen what the world looked like when humans stopped pretending to be civilized. I loosened my collar and took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension drain out of my shoulders. I'd been out there maybe 5 minutes when I heard the soft click of heels on stone. Eliza appeared beside me, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves, holding her shoes in one hand because the heels were too much for the terrace's uneven stones. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking out at the gardens like she was seeing them for the first time. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet I almost missed it over the distant sound of music and laughter from inside. I didn't expect them to stand. It took me a moment to understand what she meant, and when I did, something tight loosened in my chest. She was talking about the chapel, about that moment when 200 people had risen to their feet without being asked, turning our wedding into something that looked more like a military ceremony than a romantic celebration. They didn't stand for show, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. They stood for survival. She turned to look at me then, really look at me, maybe for the first time since I'd walked down that aisle in my dress whites. Survival? Mine and theirs, I said. Those men followed me into places where following the wrong person meant never coming home. They stood up because they trusted me to keep them alive, and I did. That's not ceremony, Eliza. That's not politics or protocol or whatever you think military service is about. That's life and death, and the bonds that form when you go through that kind of fire together. She nodded slowly, like she was processing information that didn't fit into any of the categories she'd used to organize her world. Then she reached over and took my hand, her fingers small and soft against my calloused palm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "About the message. About asking you not to wear the uniform. I was scared." Of what? Of not understanding. Of being married to someone whose life I couldn't comprehend. She squeezed my hand. "I love you, Alden. I just don't know if that's enough." Standing there in the darkness, holding hands with my new wife while our reception continued without us, I realized she was right to be scared. Love wasn't enough when you only love the parts of someone that fit your vision of who they should be. But maybe, if we were both willing to try, understanding could grow into something stronger. Maybe it would have to be. 3 days into our honeymoon in Bar Harbor, Maine, I was finally starting to believe that maybe Eliza and I could figure this out. We'd spent the morning walking the rocky coastline, her hand in mine, talking about everything except the elephant that had been sitting in our relationship for 2 years. The sea air was doing something good for both of us, washing away the tension that had built up during months of wedding planning and careful negotiations about who I was allowed to be. The inn where we were staying was one of those quaint New England places with creaky floors and windows that looked out over Frenchman Bay. Eliza was napping in the afternoon sun streaming through our room when my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Lyle. We'd grown up together before Dad shipped us around the world, and Lyle was one of the few family members who'd made the trip to witness my supposed march toward domestic bliss. "Check your email," the text said. "Thought you should see this." I opened my laptop, curious and slightly annoyed that family drama was following me on my honeymoon. But when I saw what Lyle had sent, my breath caught in my throat like I'd taken a punch to the solar plexus. It was a photo of the chapel parking lot, taken during the ceremony from Lyle's car window. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a figure in navy dress blues. Tall, ramrod straight, standing alone by a black sedan that I recognized as my father's pristine 1987 Crown Victoria, the car he'd maintained with the same obsessive attention to detail he'd applied to everything else in his life. Commander Gerald Mercer. My father. The man who'd raised me in silence and disappointment, who'd never attended a single graduation or promotion ceremony, who'd responded to my acceptance into Annapolis with a warning not to let it go to my head. He'd been there, watching from the parking lot like some kind of ghost, close enough to witness but too far away to participate. I stared at that photo for 10 minutes, zooming in on the distant figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The timestamp showed it was taken right in the middle of the ceremony, probably around the time my team was standing and shouting, "Admiral on deck." He'd been there for all of it, watching his son get married while maintaining the same careful distance he'd perfected over 30 years. The second photo showed him walking away, head down, shoulders slightly hunched in a way I'd never seen before. For just a moment, he looked old, tired, maybe even sad, though that might have been wishful thinking on my part that I was still staring at the screen when there was a knock at our door. Eliza stirred from her nap as I went to answer it, expecting maybe the housekeeping staff or someone from the front desk. Instead, I found a hotel employee holding an envelope. "Mr. Mercer? This was delivered for you. The gentleman said it was urgent." The envelope was cream-colored, Expensive paper with my name written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. The same precise, military block letters that had signed my report cards and marked up my homework for 18 years. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and the words were written in the same careful script. Alden, I came to see you married, but I couldn't make myself walk through those doors. I've spent 30 years not knowing how to be a father to the man you became. When I saw those men stand up for you, saw the respect in their faces, I realized something I should have understood long ago. You became the leader I never could be. You earned something I never learned how to give, the kind of loyalty that comes from love, not fear. I didn't salute you because I didn't know how to salute the man who surpassed everything I ever was. That I should have been proud of you years ago. I should have said it when you graduated from Annapolis, when you made Admiral, when you brought those men home alive. I should have been the father you deserved instead of the one you got. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see you. Dad, I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my uniform pocket, right next to my heart. When Eliza found me sitting on the edge of the bed 20 minutes later, staring out at the ocean, she didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat beside me and waited. My father was at the wedding, I said finally. He came, but he couldn't come inside. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, maybe that was his version of trying. Maybe it was. And maybe, after 30 years of silence, that was enough to start building something new. Back at base, the routine felt different somehow. Maybe it was the wedding ring catching the light when I signed paperwork. Or maybe it was the way my perspective had shifted after reading my father's letter for the 100th time. The words had worn grooves in my memory. You became the leader I never could be. Coming from a man who'd never given me anything but criticism and silence, those words carried weight that kept me awake at night. Not in a bad way, but in the way that important truths do when they finally find their way home. 3 weeks after the honeymoon, Admiral Richardson called me into his office with the kind of summons that either meant promotion or court-martial, and at my level, it was usually one of the extremes. His office was standard Pentagon fare, American flag in the corner, photos with presidents and foreign dignitaries, the kind of controlled authority that came with enough stars to launch your own small war. Mercer, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, I've got something that's either going to make your career or end it, and I'm not entirely sure which. Coming from Richardson, that could mean anything from a secret mission to a congressional inquiry. What he handed me was a proposal for a new joint training program focused on ethics, leadership, and military reform. Basically, everything the Pentagon talked about wanting, but never quite figured out how to implement. The idea was to take experienced officers from all branches and teach them not just how to follow orders, but how to give them in ways that built trust instead of fear, respect instead of resentment. They want someone to run it, Richardson continued. Someone with combat experience, leadership credentials, and enough credibility to tell a room full of colonels they're doing it wrong without starting a riot. Your name keeps coming up in conversations. I thought about Rodriguez in that Humvee, bleeding but still fighting because he trusted me to get him home. I thought about Torres, walking on a prosthetic leg but still standing at attention because he believed in something bigger than himself. I thought about my father's letter, about becoming the leader he never could be. I'll do it, I said, and Richardson looked surprised that I'd answered so quickly. Don't you want to know about the assignment location? The duration? The career implications? No, sir, I said. If it's about training leaders who can bring their people home alive and whole, I'm in. That's how I ended up running the Salute Standard, a name I chose because it represented something my father's generation had never quite understood. Saluting wasn't about blind obedience or mindless respect for authority. Real salutes were earned through actions, not rank. They were given freely by people who chose to follow because they trusted where you were leading them. 6 months into the program, I found myself at a training center outside Austin, working with a group of mid-level officers who thought they knew everything about leadership because they'd read the right books and attended the right schools. The classroom was standard military beige, filled with men and women who carried themselves with the confident posture of people who'd never had their certainty tested by real fire. During a break between sessions, a young cadet approached me. Couldn't have been more than 22. Still had that eager shine that comes before the world teaches you how much you don't know. His name tag read Patterson, and there was something familiar about his face that I couldn't quite place. "Admiral Mercer," he said, and his voice carried the kind of nervous respect that made me feel ancient. "I wanted to thank you for something you probably don't even remember." I'd learned over the years that when someone starts a conversation that way, you're about to hear a story that matters more than you realize. "What's that, son?" My father was Staff Sergeant Michael Patterson. Somalia, 1995. "You pulled him out of a burning Humvee when he was unconscious and bleeding out." The words hit me like a physical blow, bringing back memories of dust and gunfire and the metallic taste of fear. "He told me you carried him 200 yards under enemy fire, got him to the medics. Said you saved his life." Patterson. The name came flooding back along with images I'd tried to forget. A young soldier trapped in twisted metal, flames licking at his uniform, enemy bullets stitching patterns in the dirt around us. I'd done what needed doing, same as always, but hearing about it from his son made it feel different somehow. "He told me you bled so he could come home." The cadet continued, and his voice was thick with emotion he was trying to control. "Said you were the kind of leader who'd die for his men, and that's the kind of officer I want to be." My throat tightened until I could barely speak. "How is he?" "Your father?" "Good, sir. Really good. He's a fire chief now in Oklahoma, married my mom, raised 3 kids. He never missed a little league game or a school play. Said he owed you a lifetime he almost didn't get to live." That's when it hit me. This was legacy. Not the medals on my chest or the commendations in my file, but the quiet ripples that spread out from moments of choice. Patterson had gone home, built a family, raised a son who wanted to serve because he'd learned from his father what good leadership looked like. That kid standing in front of me, eager to learn how to lead with honor, existed because I'd made a choice in a dusty street 25 years ago. That night, alone in my hotel room, I thought about my father again, about the distance he'd maintained, the emotional walls he'd built, the way he'd confused fear with respect and silence with strength. He'd been a good officer by the standards of his time, but he'd never learned the most important lesson of command. Your legacy isn't what you accomplish, it's what you enable others to accomplish. I wasn't angry with him anymore. How could I be? His failures had taught me what not to become, and maybe that was its own kind of gift. I was finally at peace with the man who'd raised me, because I'd become someone he could finally be proud of. 1 year later, I stood on a stage at the Pentagon, looking out at an audience filled with the kind of people who usually made me want to find the nearest exit. Politicians, defense contractors, senior brass who spent more time in boardrooms than they ever had in battle. The whole Washington machinery that kept the military-industrial complex humming along. But this time was different. This time, I was here because the salute standard had actually worked. The Department of Defense's Ethical Leadership Award wasn't something they handed out lightly. It went to officers who'd proven that you could lead with honor, that discipline and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that respect was something you earned rather than demanded. Standing there in my dress blues, looking at the crystal trophy that would probably end up in a box somewhere, I thought about all the young officers who'd come through our program and gone back to their units with a different understanding of what leadership meant. I in the front row, Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing the kind of proud smile that told me she was finally starting to understand. The past year hadn't been easy. We'd had fights about my travel schedule, arguments about whether I was more married to the military than to her, conversations that lasted until 3 in the morning about what it meant to love someone whose job required pieces of their soul. But she'd stuck it out, started asking questions instead of changing the subject, even attended a few family events for Gold Star families. She was learning, and so was I. But it was the figure in the back corner that made my throat go tight. Commander Gerald Mercer, retired, 73 years old, and still standing like he had a steel rod for a spine. He'd driven down from Annapolis, probably spent an hour getting his uniform perfect, come to watch his son receive recognition for being the kind of leader he'd never learned how to be. When they called my name and I walked to the podium, the applause was polite, professional, the kind of sound you got when people were impressed but not emotionally invested. I gave my speech about leadership through service, about earning respect instead of demanding it, about the responsibility that came with asking people to follow you into danger. Standard stuff, really, but I meant every word. Then something happened that stopped me mid-sentence. From the back corner, moving with the deliberate precision of 3 decades in the Navy, my father stood up. Slowly, carefully, he brought his right hand to his forehead in a salute that was picture-perfect in its execution. Not because regulation required it, not because protocol demanded it, not because anyone was watching or expecting it. He saluted because he finally understood what I'd become, what those stars on my shoulder really meant, what it looked like when a son surpassed everything his father had ever achieved. The salute lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When he lowered his hand, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not pride, exactly, but recognition. Understanding. Maybe even respect. After the ceremony, he found me in the reception area, threading his way through the crowd like he was navigating a minefield. When he reached me, he didn't hesitate, didn't look around to see who was watching. He just extended his hand. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, and his voice was steady but quiet. "I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." I shook his hand, felt the calluses that matched my own, the strength that was still there after all these years. "It's okay, Dad. I understand." Later, when Eliza asked if the salute had meant anything, I thought about all the years of silence, all the missed opportunities, all the words we'd never said. It meant everything, I told her, because sometimes blood doesn't salute. But when it finally does, it's not about revenge or vindication or proving you were right all along. It's about recognition, the moment when someone finally sees you for who you really are and decides that person is worth honoring.